just 20 miles south of Rome, sits a quiet volcanic crater filled with dark, still water. For centuries, fishermen working Lake Nemi found heavy objects tangled in their nets. They were not catching fish, but pulling up fragments of intricate marble mosaics. They hoisted up copper wolves, gilded bronze lions, and massive timber beams sheathed in lead. The lake is incredibly small, and it has no outlet to the sea. Yet the artifacts rising from the mud belonged to ships larger than any known in antiquity. Local legends claimed the Emperor Caligula had deliberately sunk his floating pleasure palaces here. But no diver could survive the crushing depth or the freezing mud to prove it. So, in 1928, an engineering team decided to stop looking through the water. If they could not reach the bottom, they would simply remove the lake. They reactivated a 2,000-year-old Roman tunnel and began to pump the water out. What emerged from the receding shoreline over the next 4 years would completely rewrite the history of naval engineering. But this unparalleled discovery was destined to be lost a second time. The first serious attempt to reach the bottom happened in 1446. The Renaissance architect Léon Baptiste Alberti floated a massive raft of empty wine barrels over the wreck site. He hired Genoese free divers, ordering them to plunge into the freezing darkness with heavy iron grappling hooks. They swam down blind, driving themselves into a suffocating layer of silt. Their hooks caught on something massive in the mud, but they could only tear away isolated fragments of pine timber and heavy sheets of lead. The hull itself was buried too deep to move. Nearly a century later, in 1535, a military engineer named Francesco de Marchi tried again. He wore a primitive wooden diving bell, invented by his companion Guglielmo di Lorena. De Marchi descended into the pitch-black water of Lake Nemi. Through the thick glass window of his wooden barrel, he saw the colossal timbers of a ship. He described beams of larch and pine, fastened with copper nails as long as a man's forearm, but the pressure at that depth was agonizing. De Marchi bled from his nose and ears and nearly drowned when the crude breathing tubes failed. For the next 300 years, the dark crater defeated every salvage attempt. The deep mud preserved the timber perfectly, but it also held the colossal ships in an unbreakable grip. No diver could survive the freezing depth long enough to dig them out. If the wrecks were ever going to see the sun again, the engineers would have to stop fighting the water. They would have to eliminate it. By 1927, the Italian government decided the ships had to be recovered. But reaching them meant moving over 40 million cubic meters of water. An engineer named Guido Uccelli proposed an unprecedented solution. They would not build a modern aqueduct over the steep crater wall. Instead, they would use a drainage tunnel carved entirely by the ancient Romans. 2,000 years earlier, engineers had cut a narrow passage straight through the volcanic rock. It was designed to keep the lake from flooding, but it had been blocked for centuries. Uccelli and his team cleared the ancient stone shaft. Then, they installed colossal industrial pumps directly on the shoreline. On October 20th, 1928, the engines roared to life. 4 giant pipes began sucking water from the lake, driving it straight through the mountain. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dark waterline began to drop. For months, the engines ran without stopping. The shoreline receded, exposing acres of unstable, shifting mud. The depth gauge dropped 10 feet, then 30, then 50. As the water fell away, the deep basin was finally exposed to the sun, and rising from the drying lake bed was a dark, curving wall of timber. It was not a shattered fragment or a loose wooden rib. It was the intact bow of a ship, and it kept going. By early 1929, the mud surrounding the highest peak of timber was carefully cleared. What lay beneath the silt was not a standard Roman galley. It was a massive, flat-bottomed barge, measuring over 70 meters in length. For context, that is larger than the wooden galleons that sailed the oceans 15 centuries later. The freezing mud had acted like a perfect time capsule. The ancient pine and oak timbers were not just intact. They still bore the exact tool marks of the men who shaped them 2,000 years ago. As the pumping continued through 1930, a second dark shape broke the surface. The Second Nave, the second ship, was even larger than the first. It stretched 73 meters across the lake bed, a colossal footprint of Roman engineering. Engineers in suits and hats walked carefully along the sheer wooden walls. They looked like insects, standing beside the curving timber hull. The sheer physical size of the vessels answered one question. These were the floating pleasure palaces, commissioned by Caligula. But clearing the mud from the heavy decks revealed a different problem. The structural framing and the metalwork did not match first-century technology. They matched a level of engineering that was not supposed to exist for another 1,000 years. By 1932, both massive hulls were completely freed from the mud. The effort to move them was an industrial triumph in its own right. They were slowly dragged onto the shoreline, using a complex system of pulleys and steel rails. But as researchers finally gained access to the dry decks, the historical timeline began to fracture. Beneath the rotting timber, they found rotating platforms. They were mounted on perfectly spherical bronze ball bearings. The Romans had designed a frictionless system to allow heavy statues to rotate seamlessly. It was a mechanical concept, traditionally credited to the Renaissance. An invention supposedly created 1,400 years after these ships sank. The discoveries did not stop. They documented advanced rotary piston pumps designed to clear water from the lower decks. They mapped a vast network of heavy lead plumbing. They found fragments of copper roofs and pillars made of imported colored marble. Caligula had built an imperial villa, complete with heated baths and intricate mosaic floors. He had engineered a stone palace to float. These were not primitive barges. They were proof of a Roman technological peak that was completely lost during the empire's collapse. Erased to protect the fragile timber, the Italian government built a massive concrete hangar on the shoreline, the Museo delle Navi Romane. By 1939, the twin vessels were housed under a secure, waterproof roof. For the first time in 2 millennia, they were finally safe. But outside the thick concrete walls, a new shadow was falling across Europe, and the greatest archaeological triumph of the century was directly in the path of a modern war. By the spring of 1944, the Second World War had reached the quiet shores of Lake Nemi. The advancing Allied forces pushed north through Italy, forcing the German army into a desperate retreat. A German anti-aircraft battery established its position just yards from the Museo delle Navi Romane. The massive concrete structure offered a perfect tactical vantage point over the crater. Inside the silent halls, the ancient ships sat unguarded in the dark. On the night of May 31st, heavy artillery fire echoed across the lake. A fire broke out inside the main gallery. The dry, 2,000-year-old pine and larch timbers ignited instantly. The blaze quickly turned the vast museum into a concrete furnace. The heat was severe enough to melt the ancient copper nails and shatter the huge arched windows. It compromised the steel roof structure, sending colossal slabs of concrete crashing down onto the burning hulls. When dawn finally broke over the lake, the greatest archaeological triumph of the century was gone. All that remained of Caligula's floating palaces were smoldering piles of white ash and a few twisted pieces of bronze. Today, Lake Nemi has refilled. The dark water is quiet again, looking exactly as it did for 2 millennia. The greatest ships of the ancient world survived 2,000 years in the freezing mud, protected by the very depth that hid them. They survived empires collapsing, only to last a single decade in the modern world. Sometimes, history is safest exactly where it sank.